I'm having some really interesting conversations behind the scenes with homeschool moms about our big emotions. I just sent out a newsletter actually with the 4 tools that I've created and I've used to address my big emotions in my homeschool. So these conversations that I'm having are not light. They are really a driving force in how we're engaging our lives. So big emotions. When I'm talking about that, I think the reason I'm talking that in a homeschool context is because I've learned it in myself. I've learned myself that our big emotions sap our energy when we're not creating a plan around them to address them, to get clear on why we're experiencing them, to have a plan for our triggers or frustrations, or when we feel confused or sad, or you name the human emotion, we have them as homeschool moms because we're humans. Yes, superhuman, but also human. We have those big emotions and they interfere with our energy. They interfere with how we're engaging our kids. We end up feeling guilty at times because we are overreacting. But we're overreacting because we haven't actually really embraced our own experience of what's going on. Maybe, and this is the behind the scenes conversations that I've been having for maybe about 3 or 4 days with certain people, that we haven't had someone hold those emotions before. There are very many different elements or tools that I've used over the course of my lifetime and continue to use. You might have heard the words reparenting or nonviolent communication, internal family systems, self-compassion. What else can I add? There's so many different modes of approaching the challenges that we have in our lives, whether that's our relational challenges with others or our relational challenges with ourselves. And when I'm talking big emotions and how to address our big emotions and how to create a plan for our big emotions, I'm speaking about our relationship with ourselves, which always influences our relationship with our kids or with our partner or with anyone significant at all. And I think this is a lifelong work. But if we don't get some self-awareness that it's a challenge, then really we're just making everything more difficult. It is so challenging, dare I use that word repeatedly, but it is so challenging to come to that place of acceptance that we actually have some internal work to do. That every bit of our internal work is benefiting us and our relationship with others, and how we feel about ourselves, how we show up in our lives, how purposeful we are in things that have maybe nothing to do with homeschooling. So the conversations that I'm having are a lot deeper than just feeling uncertain about our homeschool choice or wondering how we address other people when they're questioning us and we're feeling uncertain, or we see something on Instagram that we say, that is really cool, but I'm not doing that, so I guess I'm not good enough in what I'm doing for homeschooling, or, the myriads of possible experiences that we have. Those are really important discussions to have, and I love to address all of that because I'm here to make you feel confident, but you can only really feel confident if you're convinced of those things in yourself. But the biggest challenge is us dealing with ourselves, us building on a relationship with ourselves. And that starts with addressing the fact that we don't always feel good. And it's not just because it's slump month. It's not just because the days are grayer. Maybe it's not just because we're being hormonal, or it's not just because of someone else is doing something. It's because we are engaging ourselves and the thought patterns that we've had over the course of time in a way that is not serving us. So when I had a specific conversation with, you know who you are, this morning, I was reminded, she had shared with me something that I know myself, that to go deep into acceptance of the hardest things that are in here feels really yucky. And that is exactly what my experience has been. In fact, I would go farther and say that to embrace all the things that I have felt in here and experienced over the course of my life with the childhood experiences that I've had, yeah, it's more than just yucky. It's sometimes scary to go there and be honest about what's in here. It really is. I'll tell you the first time. I'm a writer. I've always been a writer since I was 7-ish, and I would write stories. And so when I started to write my life stories, I've essentially written a memoir that's not published. But there was one story that I wrote in the context of a creative writing group. I shared a full-on real story that I knew was outrageous. It sounded outrageous on paper because it was outrageous in my experiencing of it. And so I wrote this story. I felt like I put my whole world and my whole insides out on paper for everybody to read. And you know what happened? I almost had like an anxiety attack and wanted to faint or pass out because it was so intense sharing this really big story. And these 7 or 8 women in the group, after I shared my 500-word story, they said, I don't think it's real. Couldn't be real. You'll have to include certain elements to make it feel more real. And I was like, wait, what? They thought it wasn't even real? Wow. I was in shock and awe that they didn't think it was real. I just splayed out all my guts, all the real things that had happened to me in this one 3-hour memory. And people didn't even think it was real. That was surreal for me. But it didn't matter because I don't need other people to see that something was real. It was real, but they actually thought it was a fictional narrative anyways, and it sounded too outrageous. I had portrayed it as though it was a fictional narrative because it was too vulnerable for me to share as my own story. And I've since come to understand that me telling myself the stories that are true, me declaring to myself and to the world that this is how I really have experienced things, is most effective for me. We can tell ourselves different stories around the things that have happened in the past, but more importantly, owning it, really owning something and saying, yeah, this is how I feel when something happens. Some of us have really big stories. Some of us have stuff that we are sifting through that we wish we didn't have to sift through. And I wish if that were you, or if that is you, then I wish it wasn't so. I wish it wasn't so in my own life. I wish it wasn't so in your life or in all the people's lives, the people that I get to hear their stories. I wish it wasn't so. And it is. We don't have to live in those stories. We do live in those stories, and we keep living in those stories when we don't accept and acknowledge what has been true for us, what we really have experienced. But that's the beginning of it, of addressing our big emotions and dealing with what's really going on in here, is to acknowledge first what's going on, or at least declare what we understand to be the story. And then go towards so many different self-awareness strategies that help to just clarify why we think what we think. We have different experiences of the same story. If you have a sibling, you know that your experience of something that happened in your childhood is different because you're different. Just like your kids have different stories about maybe Christmas this year and how it felt, or what what brought them the greatest joy, or what was the biggest issue that day. They'd all have different stories. We all have different stories about different things. But it's not that we're looking for the exact right truth in something as much as owning the fact that we're experiencing it in a certain way, that we're showing up every day in a certain way. And sometimes the way we're telling our stories to ourselves is influencing that we can't hold something. We can't hold a frustration, or we're telling ourselves we can't be patient when, or we are always going to feel guilty because of something that we did or we're doing. we're telling ourselves stories. We need to go to the root. We need to look at our big emotions, be self-aware, be honest with our stories, and then say, hey, what am I going to do so that I can recreate the stories, or I can tell myself something that's true? So that's certainly been my last few decades, or 2 decades, almost 2 decades next year, how my stories began to be recreated, and it has been a powerful life story that I wouldn't have signed up for, but it happened because it happened. And so I decided not to stay in that, what I'll call a victim story of things are not going to be good because this thing happened to me, or I'm always going to be frustrated when somebody does something, or I'm always going to feel overwhelmed, or I'm always going to feel, no, it's true. You're going to always feel those things if you are deciding that you're going to always feel those things. But if you can look at your stories, be honest about your stories, get a plan to address those stories or those big emotions that are fueling those stories, you can change your story.